Well, here we are again. AMD stock got hammered on Friday, dropping by over 11% to about $23 per share, as an analyst gave the stock a sell rating with a price target that is very low at around $18 per share. So I've been getting a lot of comments and messages from my subscribers asking me questions about what happened and do I think that AMD stock will recover. All great questions. Let's get started. What's up, everybody? My name is Ale and welcome to my world of AMD. I'm just kidding. Welcome to my world of stocks. I know it feels like I talk about AMD a lot, but I have a lot of videos coming up on many different stocks, so I think you'll be happy with the upcoming content. So just hang in there if you're sick of hearing me talk about AMD. But speaking of AMD, as you guys know, I'm kind of in a weird spot because I've cashed in a lot of my profits with AMD for really no reason other than the fact that it climbed too fast and I wanted to lock in those huge profits. But I still receive questions about AMD all the time. But if you've been following me since the beginning of the channel, then you know that my history with AMD has been a little bit more of like a swing trade kind of strategy, but I would call it more of like a medium to long-term kind of swing trade strategy, which I know sounds weird, but whenever people become very bearish on AMD, that's historically when I've bought large amounts of shares of AMD, and especially around that $10 price. Every time that AMD was trading for around $10, everybody was hugely bearish on AMD, saying that it was going to go all the way down to 5 to 4, even to 3. And all the meanwhile, I was very bullish and I was saying, look, it's a no-brainer. At around $10, the stock is a no-brainer, and I was picking up many shares. But then AMD stock started to soar, and all of a sudden, all those bears ended up turning into bulls, or at least maybe they didn't turn into bulls, but I guess all the bears just kind of disappeared. And out of nowhere, everybody and their grandmother was very bullish on AMD. And you should have seen the comments I was getting on my videos. Everybody was saying, buy AMD, buy AMD. And it was just climbing really fast, and so much hype was entering the stock. So I said, wait a minute, I kind of took a step back and I said, wait a minute, everybody's getting really bullish. I tend to do the opposite of what everybody's doing. And I said, okay, maybe it's time to lock in some of those profits because, you know, it might kind of start to correct and come back down once we get rid of all of these hype kind of short-term minded investors that were flooding into AMD. And I don't say any of that to be cocky. I'm just saying that that was kind of my history with AMD, and that's how I was kind of trading the stock. But now we're kind of getting to a point where, once again, we're kind of seeing a switch now. We're starting to see a lot of people being very bearish on the stock. And so the stock has been dropping. But even at these levels, you have to remember, this stock used to be, you know, around $10 a share when I was saying that this is a very good stock and I was buying a bunch. And now it's still at around $23 per share. So even though it's been dropping a lot recently and everybody's saying, oh man, this stock is like doomed and all this stuff, it's still up a huge amount. Year to date, it's still up 130%. And they still have a forward PE of 34. So it's not necessarily cheap, but it might be a cheap stock soon because I think we might be getting to a point where it's overly sold. And I think a lot of investors are just losing that long-term mindset. I think we're getting rid of a lot of these short-term kind of traders that jumped into the stock with all the hype, and now they've been kind of cashing in their profit. We see that any kind of volatility in the market has been kind of affecting AMD, and things that shouldn't really be affecting AMD that much, in my opinion, have been affecting it by a lot. So maybe we're starting to get to a point where it's oversold, but we're going to talk about all that, and I'm going to give you my overall opinion towards the end of the video. But just to kind of give you a spoiler, I do think that there is still a lot of potential for AMD. I still really like it, but I would like it to drop a little bit more, and then I'd like to take advantage of those lower prices. But enough of me talking about my opinion. Let's get into what's really been going on with this stock lately. Now, recently we were riding the wave of AMD having their 7nm chips out ahead of Intel, ahead of Intel's 10nm chips, because they were delaying their chips all the way till holiday 2019 with their server chips all the way till 2020. But since then, a report came out saying that a Bluefin analyst wrote a note to their clients saying that suppliers think that production of the 10nm processors could be pulled forward by 4 to 6 weeks from the June 2019 timeline. But to my knowledge, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that does not include Intel's server CPU. So those should still be in 2020, but the rest of the lineup kind of shrinks the window for AMD to steal market share. On top of that, we're dealing with a very volatile market because of a trade war with China, rising interest rates, the midterm elections being right around the corner. And so anytime you have a volatile market like that, it's going to escalate any problems or uncertainties going on with a stock like AMD, more specifically growth stocks and especially semiconductor stocks. And speaking of the semiconductor industry, it's also dealing with worries of oversupply and weak Q4 guidance in these Q3 earnings that have already started. Now, when looking at the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index, that fell around 11% since Morgan Stanley downgraded the sector back in August. And you can see that AMD was not the only chip stock to drop, but many popular stocks sunk on Friday as well, with Nvidia down over 4% and Intel and Micron both down over 2%. But when looking at the biggest reason why AMD stock dropped by over 11% on Friday, that really has to do with an analyst from New Street Research initiating coverage on AMD and giving it a sell rating with a price target of $18, which is much lower than what AMD has been trading for lately. In fact, it's close to 50% lower than their 52-week high, so it's a very bearish outlook. Now here's just a couple things that this analyst had to say. He says AMD's stock price reflects a scenario we don't believe possible. The company soared on some great wins in recent years, but it cannot win sustainably and beyond a niche positioning. He goes on to say Intel can easily bring to market an architecture similar to AMD's with better performance. And then he said Intel delayed their 14nm chips in 2014, but didn't see any negative impact from PC CPU or server CPU revenue. Okay, now I'm going to give my response to all of that, but before we do that, let's take a quick look at who this analyst is that sunk AMD stock by over 11%. So looking at his profile on TipRanks, he is ranked 1,709 with 3 stars and a 3.5% average return and a 63% success rate. Now, I'm not someone to talk trash on anybody, so the numbers are there. You can form your own opinion, but anyway, I'm just not going to say anything. The numbers are there. You can make your own opinion on that. Now, here's another analyst, and this one is bullish on AMD. He just reiterated his buy rating on AMD, so he's a bullish analyst. He is Cohen, I believe he's Cohen's top analyst, and so this is Matt Ramsey. And when looking at his coverage on AMD, he raised his price target from $33 up from $30. And this analyst on TipRanks, he's ranked 77. So remember, the bearish analyst, he's ranked 1,700. This one's ranked 77. This one has 5 stars. The bearish analyst had only 3 stars. This one has an average return of 23% versus the other one at only 3.5%. And this one has a 61% success rate, so it is a little bit lower than the 63% success rate of the bearish analyst. Now, I'm not throwing those comparisons for any particular reason. I just really like looking at analysts. Whenever I am reading their opinions, I like to see who they are. I like to see what their rates are. So here's the 2 analysts. You can form your own opinion on them. But anyway, back to this bearish analyst and what he had to say about AMD. So he says that AMD is in a niche position and that it's not sustainable. So I don't know if he's referring to the security vulnerabilities of Meltdown, Spectre, and now Foreshadow, but those aren't little niche things. Those are big deals. Foreshadow cuts up to 30% of Intel's performance in the server CPU market. So if a server client wants to stick with Intel, they basically have to choose between, cut down performance or security vulnerabilities, whereas you don't have to deal with those issues with AMD using EPYC. But even if he's just talking about AMD and Intel just kind of in the general sense, I guess, AMD is just now finally, after a very long time, finally releasing some very competitive products in these higher end segments. And this is across a very well diversified portfolio. And depending on which exact segment you're looking at, Intel and Nvidia basically ran unchecked for a very long time. But now you're telling me that AMD, just having one competitor in AMD is not sustainable? Like there's not enough room in these markets for a competitor? I mean, do you realize that there's virtually no other competitor in the discrete GPU market? And AMD is doing very well there. They climbed from a market share of just 30% last year to 36% this year, while Nvidia actually dropped from 70% down to 64%. And when looking at the server CPU market, Intel basically had 100%, almost 100% of that market until, AMD finally released EPYC and started competing there. They used to compete a long time ago, but now, they basically went for a very long time not competing. Now they came out with EPYC, I think in 2017, and started competing again and stealing some of that market share. And when looking at Intel, they still have plans to release 14 nanometer chips all the way throughout 2019 with Cascade Lake and Cooper Lake, until they finally get to a 10 nanometer process with Ice Lake in 2020. But all the meanwhile, AMD will already be on 7 nanometers. Not to mention that Intel has been dealing with supply shortages on their 14 nanometer chips, so they were basically forced to prioritize on their high performance segments, leaving the door wide open for AMD in the entry level PC market. And that's with AMD already having plenty of momentum. When you look at the server CPU market, in the previous quarter, AMD only had about 1.3% of that market share, with the rest going to Intel. But they also saw EPYC server chip shipments increase by 50% over the previous quarter, and most analysts predict that they'll reach mid-single digit market share by the end of this year, and that should grow to double digits next year. And we already know of partnerships with HP, Microsoft, Dropbox, Packet, Tencent, Cisco, and many more. Not to mention that the bullish analyst we were talking about earlier, Matt Ramsey, he recently said that he expects announcements soon from Amazon and Google, which would be huge for AMD. And we've talked about this a lot in the past, but if AMD steals just around 10% of that market share, which, they're expected to do by next year, then we're talking about, billions of dollars, or $2 billion or more of revenue that AMD can gain. And this year alone, AMD is only projected to do about $6.5 billion in revenue, around, give or take a little. So a few extra $1 billion of revenue is a big deal. And even when looking at AMD's most important segment, that being the graphics and computing segment, which makes up over 60% of AMD's revenue, that saw growth of 64% year over year. So they're seeing enormous growth in their most important segment. And it's not just because AMD got lucky or they're in some kind of niche position. It's because they release very compelling products that offer competitive performance at much lower prices, that are going to be upgraded even more to smaller nodes with better performance. And you can see that with Ryzen, EPYC, Vega, and Navi. And if I'm being honest, this analyst talked about sustainability. The biggest bear argument that I hear when it comes to sustainability is that Intel and Nvidia will release new products that will bring down the prices of their existing products, and so AMD will no longer be able to compete with competitive products at lower prices. But okay, so to give you an example, Nvidia released their Turing GPUs, right? So it's like 2080 or whatever, the 2080 line. They're saying, okay, well, that's going to bring down prices of the 1070, the 1080, or what have you. But, it's not like AMD is just going to be there and say, oh, Nvidia and Intel are releasing new products. Guess we got to find a new market. It's ridiculous. AMD is releasing new products as well. It's not like they're just sitting around. In fact, I would argue that the smartest investors that jumped into AMD are investing for the future, for products that haven't even come out yet, especially, their 7 nanometer chips that are going to offer very good performance and still at much lower prices. And as those products come out, AMD's other products will also go down in price. So it's not like, Nvidia is just going to go, oh, let's just cut our prices, and AMD will just be like, okay, we'll just hang out here. No, AMD is going to lower their prices too, because AMD, again, is releasing products in the future. And then another thing that this analyst had to say was that Intel delayed their 14 nanometer products back in 2014, and that it didn't hurt Intel's revenue at all. But you gotta remember, back in 2014, what did AMD really have to compete in those high-end, CPU and server CPU markets? AMD had no market share back then. You can see that on this chart here, that AMD's server market share was going down and Intel was just completely dominating. And when looking at AMD's, competitive products, when looking at Zen, the Zen architecture, and Ryzen and EPYC, those products didn't even come out until 2017. So why are we talking about 2014? This is a whole new ball game. It's not 2014. We're now dealing with, we're now in 2018 and we're looking towards the future. But I'm not arguing that Intel and Nvidia don't offer better products. Sometimes I get comments saying, why do you hate so much on Intel? Why do you hate so much on Nvidia? I don't hate those at all. I used to be invested in Nvidia, and I cashed out way too early, if I'm being honest with you. Again, I always tell you guys, I don't make the best calls. Some people think, I make really good predictions. I really don't. But, I'm not bearish on Intel or Nvidia. I'm just saying that there's room for competition. And when you get these bearish analysts, I'm not trying to talk trash on this analyst. I'm sure he's a really smart guy. He gets paid infinitely, more money than I do. But I'm just saying that there's room for competition. And AMD, in my opinion, under the leadership of Lisa Su, they're doing everything that they should be doing. They're focusing on pretty good performance at much lower prices. So I think that there's room for AMD to kind of come in there and steal some of that market share. Intel had almost 100% of the server market, and you're telling me that there's no room or that it's unsustainable for AMD to be in that market? I think it's ridiculous. Now, my opinion on AMD right now, and if I think the stock is going to recover. First, let's take a look at how it's ranked on tip ranks, and not that I hold much weight to this, but in the last 3 months on tip ranks, AMD has 10 buy ratings, 11 hold ratings, and only 3 sell ratings, giving AMD an overall moderate buy ranking with an average price of $28, representing about 20% upside. And when looking at the pros of AMD, I think in the short term, you're talking about AMD filling some of the voids left by Intel's shortages, and then kind of in the long term, you're dealing more with their 7nm product lineup. And, if you're bullish on AMD, then you're bullish on those products doing well, looking out into 2019 and 2020. But right now, I'm not in any hurry to pick up more AMD shares. And I know that a lot of my viewers are very bullish on AMD, so you may not want to hear that from me. But the reason why is because I locked in huge profits with AMD already. I was buying AMD when it was at around $10. And I did buy after that too. I bought when it was higher as well. But the bulk of my shares were bought at around $10. So I made huge profits on AMD. And I'm not in any kind of a hurry to jump back into AMD because there's a lot of volatility in the market. And I've been invested in AMD long enough to know that volatility in the market is not good for a stock like AMD. Now, I have a few different feelings on AMD kind of in the short term. Now, trade tensions with China is kind of important. If we open up talks again with China, that could be good for the market. Once we get past these midterm elections, in my opinion, don't hold me to this, just my opinion, I think, or my prediction is that we're going to do much better, that the market will stabilize and perform much better after the midterm elections. And but probably the biggest thing that's going to affect AMD stock, if I'm being honest with you, is going to be earnings, which is coming up very fast. It's actually this week. I think it's on the 24th. Now, when looking at earnings, it's looking like AMD expected $1.65 billion to $1.75 billion in revenue. And then, according to FactSet, Wall Street lowered their expectations from $1.76 billion to $1.7 billion. And they also lowered their earnings estimates from 13 cents down to 12 cents per share. And looking at last year in the same quarter, AMD reported 10 cents per share and $1.64 billion in revenue. So I don't think the bar is very high for AMD. I think they can actually come out with pretty strong earnings. But I think a lot of people are just going to really be paying attention to the earnings call. I think that's going to be a big deal, listening to Lisa Su and hearing them talk about trade tensions, market share, what they kind of think they can get in any segment. And looking at upcoming products, that's going to be huge, what they have to say about upcoming products and the roadmap. And then also their margins. So how are they doing with their margins, and if those are growing and things like that. But I'm not one to gamble on earnings. I have a horrible track record. Thank God that my track record is not on tip ranks, because I probably have a pretty bad track record. But I don't like to gamble on earnings. So for me with AMD, I'm hoping that AMD kind of goes down a little more before I start picking up shares. But at this point, I like it when everybody's bearish on AMD. I like that. I want everybody to be very bearish on AMD. I want it to drop a little more, and then that's when I start to go in heavy on AMD. But for that to kind of happen, we need a little more volatility in the market. Things need to go a little bit worse. Earnings has to be bad. But so I would say don't be surprised if this stock tanks more, and if it does, I'll be picking up those shares. And also don't be surprised if AMD stock just starts recovering, because they come out with good earnings. Who knows? Maybe they'll even start recovering on Monday. Maybe they'll drop more on Monday. Who knows? Short term is unpredictable, in my opinion. I can't predict any kind of short term movements. But don't be surprised if it goes down. Don't be surprised if it goes up, especially with earnings after the midterm elections. Really, anything can happen. But if you want to know what it'll take for me to pick up more AMD shares, I got to see it probably a little bit lower, but more importantly, I need to see what they say in the earnings. That will really tell me a lot, and I'll definitely make an update video and let you guys know. I'll do a whole review on the earnings. I'll let you know exactly how I feel about it, and if I'll be picking up shares, I'll let you know. But guys, who cares what I think? I'm a nobody. I want to know what you guys think. Let me know in the comment section down below. How do you feel about AMD? Are you invested in AMD? Are you holding AMD? You know that I have a little bit of I have a small position in AMD that I'm just holding for the future. But for me to add to it, I told you I'd have to see those different things that we talked about. But I want to know what you guys feel, honestly. So let me know if you're bullish, bearish, what's your kind of outlook. I'd love to hear your guys' opinions and read your comments. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure that you are subscribed for future videos on AMD and AMD's earnings. And there's also going to be plenty more content on the channel about many other stocks. So please hang in there. I know I talk about AMD a lot, but plenty more videos coming. And if you want to see more videos, you want to support the channel, the biggest way you can do that is by hitting the like button and honestly leaving nice comments. Sometimes, when I read nice comments, that really motivates me, and then I go out there and I just work really hard and I put more videos out. But anyway, thank you guys for watching. I hope you all have a wonderful, beautiful day and that you take care. Bye-bye. And stay safe out in the market. I know it's a little volatile.